You're listening to the Do Something More podcast, and this is episode 8 with Vaughn Kimball on being a volunteer coach for your children's sports teams. Welcome to the Do Something More podcast, a service-oriented show where we highlight the helpers who inspire us all to do something more. I'm your host, Melissa Draper. Thank you so much for being here. All right, welcome to another episode of the Do Something More podcast. And today I'm really excited about the interview I'm doing because it is one of my siblings, and more specifically, one of my older brothers has agreed to let me interview him and come on the show. So it's my brother, Vaughn. And Vaughn, thanks so much for being willing to come on the show today.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
I look up to my brother Vaughn, and there's a lot of things I could probably use a podcast episode to talk to you about. But I wanted to do today's episode on parents who volunteer to coach their kids' sports teams, because there's a lot of awesome parents out there that do that with their kids for the love of the sports and the love of their kids as well. So that's what we're going to be kind of delving into today. But first, Vaughn, do you want to just give us a little intro and a little background to introduce yourself?
Okay, great. So I'm the dad of 6 kids. My wife Tavi and I have been married for 23 years. We live in Caldwell, Idaho. I work for Idaho Power Company as an archaeologist for their environmental compliance department. We've been here for a little over 15 years. I guess maybe some of my background that's pertinent to the topic of this interview is kind of how I got into coaching. Before I started my career in archaeology, I actually was a middle school / junior high school science teacher, and I coached the boys track team for 2 years while I was a teacher. And I would say that was actually probably my introduction. That's where I found how much I enjoyed working with kids and coaching kids, and just the relationships that you build and the kind of positive impact you can have in a coaching environment. So I like I say, I taught school for 2 years, and then when I got the job I have now with the power company, we moved to Idaho.
Yeah, I love that. I have a teenager doing track myself right now, and I know how much of an impact those good coaches can have on the kids, not just for the sport, but on just who they are and what they're doing in life in general. So I love that. So how did you then transition that to working with your own kids and the different things that they were interested in?
So I would say, as a parent, I always kind of had the mindset that I wanted my kids to explore their own talents and find what they enjoyed. I feel like there's other kinds of good life lessons you learn from learning how to cooperate with somebody and strategize with people and implement and use those things in stressful situations. And so we always kind of encouraged our kids to try something. It never really mattered to me what it was, but we always kind of encouraged them to try something. So I guess as a parent, when my own kids started getting old enough that you sign them up for community sports teams and things like that, I realized that if I wanted them to do it, it would help if I showed a good attitude and an interest in participating in it as well. So part of the reason I brought up the school experience, and I don't know, maybe this is the right place to share this, is having had that experience coaching at a junior high school.
Mm-hmm.
It helped my confidence. It helped me feel more confident about my ability to work with a group of kids because I had done it before. And granted, my own kids, we're talking about like 7 and 8 year olds as opposed to 15-year olds, but
Right.
it still it helped my confidence. And as I thought about it, I realized part of that was the people that I had worked with. So when I first coached at the junior high school level, um, I don't know. I guess maybe this is an interesting or entertaining enough story. I'll share it. But
Go
when
ahead.
I when I interviewed for that job, it was a mid-year hire, and those don't. I had just barely finished my teaching certification. It was a mid-year hire, so I knew that there wouldn't be a lot of full-time positions open. And when I interviewed for it, it went well, and they seemed to like me, and I liked the school. And then the principal at the very end of the interview, he said, "I see on your resume that you ran cross country in high school. Would you be willing to coach our boys track team if we hired you?" And my first thought was, buddy, I'd be there's not a lot of things I wouldn't be willing to do just to get a full-time job with benefits. Um, but I also knew that some of the people who I would be interviewing for the same job probably wouldn't be interested in coaching the track team. I knew it was an edge, and I agreed to do it. And I was really fortunate because the girls track coach at that same school had a lot of experience coaching. So she shared with me some of the things she had learned, and she gave me a lot of source materials that brought me up to speed. And so I think that helped. I think that helped my experience a lot. So in terms of maybe a piece of advice I would give to people who are thinking about this is, if you haven't done it before, at the very least, talk to somebody who has. Get some perspective about
Mm-hmm.
what it's going to be like, because coaching kids, if you haven't done it before, there's going to be things that will be new to you or might surprise you. It's easy to forget what 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds or even 5-year-olds, I guess, depending on what you're doing. We forget what they're like, in different situations, and so it's helpful to get a little bit of input and advice from somebody else. And if you can assist somebody else
Mm-hmm.
before you put yourself in the I'm going to be the lead role, even better. I mean, I think a person could jump in and do it and probably do fine, but it's helpful to have an experienced mentor, even in something that you might see as being as simple or easy or basic as coaching little kids. It's helpful to have a mentor. It's helpful to have somebody who's been there before and can give you good advice. So
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great advice. And I think it's normal for, like you said, if you've never done anything or worked with a group of kids in that way before, it's normal to kind of be a little hesitant of how you're going to do it. And as a mother, I always get advice for what stage I'm at for my kids. So it makes sense that anyone else working with children or kids in that way to find good people they can go to for advice and direction. So I love that. So what sports, just to for curiosity's sake, what sports have you coached besides the junior high track with your kids?
so with my own kids, it's been mostly basketball and just the community type leagues, that a lot of smaller or mid-sized communities have.
Mhm. That's great. Basketball is a fun sport. So I know you talk about talking to someone. I know for me, the only coaching experience I've had is as I've done little 4 and 5-year-old boys in soccer, and that just mostly felt like herding kittens a little bit and keeping little boys contained. But when you're working with little kids, how do you move beyond just trying to keep everyone contained and moving in the same direction and paying attention to actually trying to teach them some fundamentals of the game?
Yeah, so I've done basketball, and then I was gonna throw in there I've done flag football too.
Oh, that's a
Um,
good one.
and yeah, they're a lot like what you described, with soccer. Um, I think the best advice I could give to somebody is if you can find another parent, don't be afraid to. In my experience, there's people out there who are willing to help, but they don't step forward because they don't have the experience. And if they sense that they have somebody in you that's willing to give them some guidance and allow them to participate, there's lots of people who are willing to. And you can't, if you get even just one more parent to help, you've just doubled the amount of coaching time that kids get.
Right.
Especially you're talking about 5 year olds in a soccer field, or like I said, my youngest groups, I probably were like 7 or 8 year olds on basketball courts. Those kids don't have a lot of, they need to just practice the basic mechanics of dribbling a basketball,
Right. Just the
or
fundamentals.
right, or dribbling a soccer ball, and have them not kick it too hard and get away from them. But they just need time with those mechanics. And if you can get another person who can run another drill at the other end of the field or at the other end of the court, you've just doubled the amount of time those kids get working and doing. and
Hmm.
and and it's a lot easier for them to not get distracted because they've got something to do. You can't expect kids that young to wait in line for their turn
Right.
to dribble. They're not going to. It's just not going to work. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing, I learned this from watching a more experienced basketball coach that volunteered for one of my kids' teams during a season that I felt like I was too busy to be the coach, and I would go and observe his practices, and he came up with a lot of games that
Yes.
that were based in the fundamentals and that the kids enjoyed playing. And while they were playing those games, they were dribbling, they were passing, they were shooting. And there's a lot you can nowadays. You can find a lot of these kind of ideas on YouTube and wherever else. But those are probably the two best piece of advice I could give. Find another trusted adult that can participate, and you double the amount of time the kids get working on a drill, and find games that they can play that incorporate those basic mechanics that they still need to learn, and incorporate some of the principles, especially as it pertains to like team sports, where they've got teammates that they're setting screens for or making passes to. Figure out games that allow them to practice those kind of skills.
Yeah, that's great advice. That is something that helped me working with those little 5-year-old boys. So any drill that you could turn into a game that they understood was great. So, what are some of the do you have any stories or experiences that come to mind, or some of the good things that you've experienced that have just really made you appreciative that you were there, being able to coach and be part of one of your kids' teams?
Yeah, I would say, I guess maybe I'll just share one experience.
Yeah, go ahead. Would love to
It
hear it.
was it was probably about fifth grade boys. The age group, I think, were fifth graders, maybe fifth and sixth graders, and it was just a little, community basketball league. And we had worked with them. I had another friend of mine that I know really well. One of his boys was on the team, and he had helped me all season. Well, let me throw one other thing in there about having an extra helper.
Mhm.
The other thing an extra helper can do, especially if your mind in a game is focused on coaching and helping the kids, effectively execute, if you've taught them an offense, or effectively, play defense, and you want to coach them as the game goes.
Right.
I don't. I mean, you see all kinds of people out there, right? You see people who are yelling at kids, and you can see that the kids are getting discouraged, and you obviously don't want to do that. But there's nothing wrong with positive coaching through, in the moment. That they
Right.
don't there's no place they can learn better than in the pressure of the moment of the game, as long as the coach, as long as you do it in a way that doesn't overwhelm them. That's kind of the best kind of learning environment there is. One of the things I always had my extra helper do for me was make sure that everybody got playing time. that was always super helpful to me too, because they can make sure that kids get playing time while I coach, and so that's another plug for having an extra helper. So back to the experience. It was fifth or sixth
Mm-hmm.
grade boys. It was for our community. That's the youngest age where they actually would do a tournament. Kids
Right.
kids younger than that, they just play through a season. Some of them, they don't even keep score. They just have a good time playing the sport. But this age group was the first. They were just barely old enough to have a tournament kind of experience, and they were a pretty good little basketball team. They had learned to work well. We didn't have any super talented athletes, but they had learned to work well together, and they had won most of their games, and we actually had a pretty high seed for the tournament. But one of the kids who played point guard for us, I don't remember what the conflict was, but there was a family conflict, and he wasn't able to be there that day. But I thought, especially the first game of the tournament, I thought we'd be okay. I thought we'd still be pretty competitive. And we went out there and they blew us out in the first half.
Mm.
It was ugly. I mean,
Oh.
it was one of those. They doubled our score. By the end of the first half, it was like
Mm-hmm.
20 something to 12 or something, or actually it was probably worse than that. We they blew us out, and my kids were pretty discouraged, and
Right.
you could see that a lot of it was psychological. Like, it was
Mm-hmm.
just the nerves, never having been in a tournament before. And I we kind of huddled up at halftime, and I just basically said to them, "You guys, I, you're a good basketball team. I know you're a good basketball team. I don't care about the scoreboard. Stop looking at the scoreboard. Let's just go play basketball."
Mm-hmm.
And take it one possession at a time, one defensive stand at a time, and just do what we've learned how to do this year. Oh, that's another thing I remember. My point guard couldn't be there that day, and then we had a little kid. We ran a 1-3-1 kind of half court press defense,
Mm-hmm.
and one of my quickest kids, who usually played the position that steals the pass, he got 3 fouls really quickly, and I had to pull him out of the game, and that kind of hurt us too. So you could see that anyway at halftime they were really discouraged, and I just said,
Right.
"Guys, you're a good basketball team. We've had a good season. We've had fun together. Let's not forget all of that. Just, you don't look at the scoreboard anymore. Just go out there and play basketball." And they did. And in the second half, we were much more competitive. We didn't win the game, but you could see it in their body language. And by the end, they had a good time, and they felt they the discouragement. They were disappointed, obviously, at not winning the game, but
Yeah,
but it
but
didn't end. It didn't end as a massively negative experience. And they went out there and competed. You know,
right.
they were able to compete, and they knew that they were competitive, even if the scoreboard didn't show a win at the end. And in the end, I think I have always said that in sports, they say winning isn't everything, and that is absolutely true. It's not. But a lot of the lessons that you learn from wanting to compete,
Right.
figuring out how to compete.
From
How can I
having it
compete?
matter to some extent.
Yes, yes, right. How can I compete? How can I get better at this than I was last time, even if whether I actually win or not? And so I felt like that was a really positive experience. They didn't go away feeling like, "Oh, well, we aren't any good." They felt good about themselves, and I think that there's important lessons in that too. The scoreboard doesn't always matter. I mean, it's going to matter a little bit if you're out there playing the sport, and the kids. It's funny because some of those age groups, they don't even have scoreboards, but by the end of the game, the kids all know what the score is because they've been
Right.
counting. So so
They keep
obviously,
track.
yeah, so obviously it matters to them, but it's not. It isn't the most important thing. Some of the most important lessons you learn because you are trying to get better and you do want to be competitive. But
Right.
in the end, it's that kind of character building experience. Hey, this is really hard, and it didn't turn out the way I hoped, but that doesn't mean I'm going to give up. I'm going to keep trying.
Yeah, there's definitely life lessons to be learned there to keep. keep pushing forward and going forward, even when it's not working out how you had hoped it would.
Yeah.
So, and I loved what you spoke about earlier about as a coach that you should be taking advantage of those moments to teach. And I know
Mm-hmm.
I've seen with my own kids, those are the moments they remember when a coach or someone is teaching them in that moment and then it clicks and
Mm-hmm.
they make that basket or score that goal or it works for them, and just the look on their face. I mean, those are the moments that kids remember when something that they've been working on or learning clicks in a game because of good direction from a coach. So, yeah, I think all of those things come into play and are great when we're trying to help and work with our kids. So, well, I love that. Those are some great stories and experiences. Have you had any big challenges that you've had to work through when you've been volunteering in this way with your kids' teams?
Yeah. Probably one of the hardest challenges I've experienced was having kids that for they're I don't know a better way to say it, but they're kind of hard. And I don't mean hard. They're hardened, like life has hardened them. Like
Mm,
you're trying to work with an 11 or a 12-year-old, and there's kind of a hard shell, and and you can see that you can just see that they're having a harder time building good relationships or making connections on the team, or I've seen bullying. I've seen kids that bully, and when you're trying to build a team spirit, that can be a mess.
right,
If you have a kid who seems to want to have a tendency or a a behavior where they start trying to bully other people on your own team, that can poison it for everybody. A lot of dealing with that is kind of a case by case basis. It hasn't happened to me a
right.
lot. It hasn't happened to me a lot. I'll tell you, I've seen it. I've seen that tendency on a girls' team. I've seen that tendency on a boys' team, both basketball teams that I coached. I've seen, I remember one of the flag football games, the kids coming off the field and telling me that somebody on the other team was biting them. So,
Oh my goodness.
so, so I've seen it. I've seen it. You see it I would say all age groups and all and both
Right,
genders. There's a likelihood that you're gonna see that. And for me, the most important way around that is to try and build a relationship.
right,
And depending on how hardened a child is from their life experiences, you may or may not be able to do that in the course of a short season. You have to act on the bullying, but you also have to try to build relationships all the way around. And I don't know. I've had times where I don't I worked with it all season long. When I say all season, they're short little seasons. It's just a rec league type thing. But
mhm,
and didn't feel like I made as much progress as I wanted to. And then there's other times where you noticed it in the beginning and worked with it, and it got really good. I felt like I was mostly able, but as a human being, you still worry about those little kids after you stop coaching them,
right, right, yeah,
because because you don't know what in their life made them that way, and whether or not they are able to resolve it. There's only so much you can do
right.
in that amount of time.
That you feel
But
that desire to help them in the small amount they're there with you, so,
yeah, yeah,
yeah. Yeah, there's definitely those opportunities to be, just a safe, good place for kids to land too as a coach as well. I'm sure many people could share coaches they've had that have been that for them.
yeah. And not to, I guess I'll just say this to I've so the community that I have worked with, that I had to sit through some training on how to recognize abuse in order to be a coach in that community.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's really helpful too. I used to work with the scouting program, and the training that they would do. Um, Adults need to. I've sat through more than one type of training. Okay,
Right.
I've done the scouting programs training. I did this communities training. I've sat through the volunteering, been a volunteer for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and sat through their training, and they're all good. The thing that always strikes me is that if you are an adult who's been through that training, if you're not willing to speak up when you see people who are not being consistent with the behaviors you observed or that you were taught about in those trainings, the trainings won't work. So do you understand what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
Things like no one-on-one with kids, things
Right.
like
You
always
gotta,
having two adults. If the responsible adults aren't willing to speak up when they see other adults not following those rules, then the training isn't effective anymore, right? We're not able to protect kids. And I don't necessarily want to take this to a dark place, but that happens too. There are unfortunately adults who do coaching and find themselves with relationships of trust with young people who then abuse those relationships. And so I think it's incumbent upon the rest of us to be willing to take those kinds of trainings and be willing to say something when we see behaviors that don't line up.
right. Yeah. Thanks so much for mentioning that, as I do think it's important for any way that you're going to choose to work with or volunteer with children, to remember that when you are in that position, you are serving as an advocate for them as well, and that we need to make sure we're doing those things as adults that we should be doing. And I love that you say if we don't see it in other adults, to be brave to speak up and say something, because there's a reason they give us that training and direction. And how great that your community offered that for those that were choosing to coach. I think that is awesome as well. So, well, thank you so much. So I just any other advice, that encouragement that you want to give, or just the biggest why that you found from being a coach and from those experiences?
Yeah, I did want to say something about the why question. I told that story at the beginning, about being hired at the junior high school, and the why there was to get a job.
At first, yeah.
Yeah, it was to get a job. And with my own kids, the why there was to show a good example. Have a good just a kind of a willingness to try new things kind of attitude.
Right.
Felt like if my kids saw that in me, they'd be more willing to go out and try as well. What I have discovered over time, that my why now is more like what I feel like you talked about a little bit earlier, that you realize that you have you're with these kids for a short amount of time, but if you do your job right, you can have a positive impact. And those moments when I actually, this last month, I've been volunteering as a referee for a church run basketball league for young teenage kids that maybe wouldn't otherwise get a chance to play in an organized sport. I've watched some of those kids that have some of them have probably never picked up a basketball, or at least not picked up a basketball and played on a court against other teams
Mhm.
and before. And when you see them in that environment and the way that they grow from one week to the next, and they go from being kind of shell shocked and
Right.
having no idea what they're supposed to do, to having stepping on the court and knowing where they're supposed to be, and if they catch a pass, instead of being panicked, they know what to do next. And
Mhm.
and the self-confidence that grows from that, and
Right.
the look. And I remember watching one little guy a couple of weeks ago probably make his first basket in an actual basketball game in his life, and the look on his face, on any child's face when that happens,
It's
that has
priceless.
yeah, that has become my why, because I know what that means for their self-confidence. I want kids to know that, that they have value, and that they have talent, and they have worth, and that they don't have to be the most talented at anything to be able to participate in it and enjoy it, and to be able to work at it and get better at it. You don't have to be the best ball handler. You don't have to be the best shooter. For that matter, I feel the same way about musical instruments, or singing, or
Really, any
dancing.
talent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or any kind of activity like that. And so for me, coaching youth sports, that's the why. The why is being able to facilitate sort of those positive life lessons, and the self-confidence that grows when a young person realizes, hey, you know what, I might not be as fast as so and so, or I might not be able to do whatever as well as so and so, but I can still do it, and I can still make a contribution. And that's a life lesson that they can apply in all kinds of settings through the rest of their life. um,
Yeah.
and that's what I hope to teach. That's my biggest why of all.
Well, that was a lot of fun to be able to record that interview with my brother, Vaughn Kimball, and to hear his insights on coaching kids in sports. And if you know my brother, he is amazing with youth. He's worked with them in a lot of different ways, and work and volunteer capacities. And so I was so grateful for him to come on and share his expertise and experience. And I think the number one lesson that we could learn, he had a lot of good advice to share, but one of the number one things that stuck out to me was the fact that sometimes when we volunteer, when we say yes, it can be out of obligation, or out of being a means to an end, or a way to help us reach something else, as it did with him volunteering to be a track coach so he could get a job, right? But many times as we do that, we then discover our own gifts, our talents, the things that bring us alive. And many times that volunteering can turn into a passion, and into us realizing that we found something we can truly love to share with others. So that was one of the main things I took from that interview, and really loved learning from him. So don't be afraid to say yes. You don't know what it can turn into and what experiences it might bring for you. So thank you so much for listening this week. And just as a reminder, go ahead and follow us on social media if you aren't already. We're on Instagram at dosomethingmore.podcast, or on Facebook at the Do Something More podcast. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. I'll see you next time.